At some point, somebody told you that you were too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, too needy. Maybe they didn't say it directly. Maybe it was a sigh, a rolled eye, a calm down muttered under their breath. Maybe it was a friend pulling away right when you opened up. Maybe it was a parent who flinched every time you cried. And somewhere quiet inside you, you started to believe them. You started shrinking. You started rehearsing your feelings before you let anyone see them, editing yourself down to a size that felt safer for everyone else. And here's the question that never really goes away. What if you were never too much? What if you were simply more? More aware, more responsive, more alive to a world that most people move through half asleep? See, there's a name for what you might be. Psychologists call it high sensitivity or sensory processing sensitivity. It's not a diagnosis. It's not a flaw. It's a trait, a different kind of nervous system, one that processes emotional and sensory information more deeply than most. People with this trait notice the shift in someone's tone before a single word is said. They feel the tension in a room the second they walk into it. They cry at things other people barely register. A stranger's kindness, a sad scene in a film, song that catches them off guard. And because the rest of the world doesn't process at that depth, your depth gets mistaken for excess. You're not overreacting. You're accurately reacting to things other people aren't even perceiving. But nobody tells you that when you're young. Instead, you're told to toughen up, to stop being so dramatic, to get over it already. And so you'll learn a devastating lesson far too early. The full truth of what you feel is not welcome here, so you start hiding it. This is where something called rejection sensitivity enters the picture. When you've been told enough times that your feelings are inconvenient, your nervous system starts treating emotional exposure as a threat. You become hyperaware of even the smallest signs of disapproval: a delayed text, a flat tone, a friend who seems distracted. Your body reacts as if rejection is happening, even when it isn't, because somewhere along the way, you learn that being too much gets you left. So you start performing a smaller version of yourself just to stay close to people. You laugh a little quieter. You ask for a little less. You apologize for needing reassurance, for crying at the wrong moment, for caring more than the room seemed to want you to. And slowly, without ever deciding to, you become an expert at disappearing in plain sight. But here's what almost no one explains to you: emotional intensity and depth of feeling are not the opposite of strength. They are, in many ways, the foundation of it. The same nervous system that feels heartbreak more sharply also feels joy more completely. The same person who cries at small kindnesses is often the one who remembers your birthday, who notices when you're quiet, who shows up with exactly the right words because they were paying attention the whole time. Your sensitivity was never a malfunction. It was a kind of attentiveness the world forgot how to value. Think about it. We live in a culture that prizes detachment, that rewards the cool, the unbothered, the person who seems unaffected by anything. And against that backdrop, anyone who feels things openly looks like they're malfunctioning, when really they're just one of the few people still fully online, fully feeling, fully here. There's a concept in psychology called effective empathy, the capacity to actually feel what another person feels, not just understand it intellectually. People high in effective empathy absorb the emotional temperature of a room. They sense when someone's smiling through pain. They notice the friend who's gone quiet at the party. This is an extraordinary capacity. It's also without boundaries, exhausting, because if you feel everything and you've never been taught how to filter or protect that feeling, you end up carrying weight that was never yours to carry. You apologize for crying at your own pain because you've spent so long managing everyone else's. You shrink your joy because someone once made you feel like too much excitement was embarrassing. You learn to whisper your wants because somebody somewhere made wanting things feel like a burden you were placing on them. And so you become fluent in a quiet kind of self-erasure. Not loud, not dramatic, just 1,000 small contractions over the years. A laugh held back, a need swallowed, a tear blinked away in a bathroom stall because crying at your desk felt like exposing too much. You learn to ask for less so that you're never accused of wanting too much. You learn to feel things on a delay, processing your emotions later, alone, safely, instead of in the room where they actually happened. And here's the quiet tragedy of that adaptation: it works. It keeps you safe. It keeps people close. But it also means you stop fully living inside your own life. You become a narrator of your feelings instead of an inhabitant of them. But something happens to people who spend years being told they're too much. Eventually, if they're lucky, they encounter someone or something that doesn't flinch. A friend who says, "Tell me more, not less." A therapist who says, "That makes complete sense, given what you felt." A partner who doesn't pull away when the tears come, who instead leans closer. And in that moment, something inside a person who has spent years shrinking does something it almost forgot how to do. It exhales, because the wound was never that you felt too much. The wound was that you were witnessed by people who couldn't hold what you were offering. That's not a reflection of your depth being wrong. That's a reflection of their capacity being limited. Two very different things that got tangled together in your mind for years. This is where we have to talk about emotional intensity itself, not as a problem to manage, but as raw material. Highly sensitive, deeply feeling people are disproportionately represented among artists, therapists, writers, healers, the people who create things that move other people, the people others call when they need to actually be heard. Your intensity, properly understood, is not a leak in your character. It's a kind of instrument, finely tuned, capable of registering frequencies other people can't even detect. The problem was never the instrument. The problem was that you were handed it without a manual, expected to play in rooms that weren't built to hold your sound. There's also a darker layer to this, one worth naming honestly. Sometimes, the people who called you too much weren't simply mismatched with your depth. Sometimes they were people who needed you small to stay comfortable. Because a person who feels deeply, who notices everything, who asks real questions, can be deeply inconvenient to someone who doesn't want to be seen that clearly. Your perceptiveness can expose things people weren't ready to face about themselves. So instead of sitting with that discomfort, it was easier to make it your problem. Easier to call you dramatic than to admit they felt exposed. Easier to call you needy than to admit they didn't know how to meet a need. This doesn't mean every relationship that left you feeling too much was malicious. Most weren't. Most people are just doing their best with nervous systems of their own. Plenty of them numbed out, overwhelmed, or simply never taught how to sit with someone else's depth. But understanding that distinction matters because it moves the story. It's no longer, "What's wrong with me?" It becomes, "What were they capable of holding? And was it ever really about me at all?" Now, here's where it gets complicated because depth without discernment can tip into something painful too. If you've spent your life being told you're too much, you might swing toward either extreme. Either you mute yourself entirely, becoming the easygoing one who never asks for anything, or you spill everything onto every relationship indiscriminately, hoping that somewhere someone will finally prove they can hold all of it. Neither extreme is the goal. The goal, and this takes time, is learning to feel fully and choose wisely, not feeling less, choosing more carefully who gets access to the fullness of what you feel. That's not the same as hiding. That's discernment. That's maturity built on top of sensitivity instead of in place of it. Healing this particular wound usually starts with a strange, almost rebellious act, believing your own perception again. Because after years of being told your reactions were oversized, you start doubting your own internal compass. You ask yourself, "Am I actually upset? Or am I being too sensitive again?" You second guess a real hurt because somewhere along the way you were taught your hurt needed independent verification before it counted. Healing means slowly, carefully, handing that authority back to yourself. Learning to say, "I felt what I felt, and that's enough of a reason to feel it." Not because your feelings are always factually accurate about every situation. Feelings can mislead, like anything else, but because your right to feel them was never something that required anyone else's permission in the first place. There's something else worth saying here gently. If you grew up being called too much, you likely also became incredibly skilled at reading rooms, anticipating needs, softening hard truths, managing other people's comfort. These are real skills. They've probably served you well, but they came at a cost, and the cost was usually your own spontaneity, your own permission to just be. unfiltered, unmanaged, unedited. Part of healing is learning that you're allowed to take up space without first calculating whether the room can handle you. You're allowed to want things without preemptively shrinking the want down to a more palatable size. You're allowed to cry without immediately explaining why so the other person doesn't feel burdened by your tears. And maybe the most important reframe of all is this: being told you were too much was never an objective fact about you. It was one person's, or maybe several people's, limited capacity, described as if it were a measurement of your character. A small cup doesn't get to define the ocean as excessive. It simply means the cup was small. Your depth doesn't need to apologize for outsizing the containers some people brought to hold it. What you need, what you've probably always needed, is not less feeling, but better containers, people with wider capacity, friends who don't flinch, a version of yourself that no longer flinches either. So if you've spent years quietly believing that your heart runs too hot, that your love is too heavy, that your need for connection is somehow embarrassing, consider this. The world is not short on people who feel too little. It is, actually, short on people who feel enough to actually notice each other, to actually show up, to actually stay in the room when things get real. You were never the problem to be solved. You were the depths some people simply weren't ready to meet. And somewhere, there are people, maybe fewer than you'd like, maybe more than you think, who have been waiting their whole lives for someone who feels exactly the way you do. Not because they want to fix you, but because they finally feel less alone in how much they feel too. That's not too much. That's just enough, finally, met by someone who can hold it.